This is my true story. Police found me living under a bridge in January, barely conscious from hypothermia and starvation, and when they searched my pockets for identification, they found a worn leather wallet with a driver's license that made them freeze in shock. The name on that ID was Thomas Crawford. The address listed was a mansion on the hill. But according to official records, Thomas Crawford had been declared legally dead by his family 6 months earlier. I was a ghost, a dead man still breathing, a millionaire who had been robbed and erased and left to die by the children I raised. But you won't believe what happened next. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. My name is Thomas Crawford, and I was once the owner of the largest construction company in a small Texas town, a business I built from absolutely nothing over the course of 40 years, through hard work and smart decisions and a reputation for quality that brought me clients from 3 counties. I started with just a pickup truck and some basic tools when I was 25 years old, taking any job I could get no matter how small or difficult, and slowly I built that one-man operation into an empire that employed over 200 people and generated $12 million in annual revenue. I owned properties all over the county, residential developments and commercial buildings, and the equipment needed to construct them, and by the time I was 65 years old, I was probably the wealthiest man in our town. I lived in a mansion on the hill overlooking the town, a beautiful house with 8 bedrooms and a swimming pool and views that stretched for miles in every direction. People knew my name, respected my success, pointed at my house and told their children that hard work and determination could take you from poverty to prosperity if you were willing to sacrifice and persist. I employed half the county either directly through my construction company or indirectly through the businesses that supplied us with materials and services, and I took pride in knowing that my success had created opportunities for hundreds of families who depended on the jobs I provided. I raised 3 children in that mansion, gave them every advantage and opportunity that money could buy, sent them to the best private schools and paid for their college educations, and bought them their first cars and set up trust funds so they would never have to struggle the way I struggled when I was young. My oldest son, Thomas Jr., worked in the family business from the time he was 18, learned construction from the ground up, eventually became my second in command and the person I trusted most to help me run the company. My 2 daughters married well and lived comfortable lives funded partly by the generous allowances I gave them every month, and all 3 of my children gave me grandchildren who I adored and spoiled whenever they visited. I believed that family meant loyalty forever, that the bonds between a father and his children were sacred and unbreakable, that blood was thicker than any temptation or greed or selfishness that might divide us. I had worked my entire life to build something substantial that I could pass down to my children and grandchildren, creating generational wealth that would benefit my family long after I was gone. I trusted my children completely, especially Thomas Jr., who had worked beside me for 20 years and knew every aspect of the business, and I never imagined that the people I loved and provided for would be capable of the betrayal that eventually destroyed my life. When I turned 68 years old, I started thinking about retirement, about stepping back from the daily operations of the company and letting Thomas Jr. take over as the primary owner and decision-maker. He had earned my trust through 2 decades of loyal service, had proven himself capable of running the business, and I thought it was time to reward him by making the transition official. I started the legal process of transferring ownership, gave him power of attorney to handle business matters on my behalf, added his name to all the bank accounts and property deeds so he could operate without needing my signature on every document. I thought I was setting up my succession plan, ensuring smooth transition of the family business to the next generation, securing my legacy and my children's futures through careful planning and trust. I had no idea I was actually giving my son the tools he needed to steal everything I had built, to erase me from my own life, to destroy me so completely that I would end up living under a bridge while he spent my money and pretended I never existed. The mansion on the hill, the construction company, the $12 million in assets, the respect and reputation I had built over 40 years, all of it would be taken from me by the son I loved and trusted more than anyone in the world, and by the time I understood what was happening, it would be too late to stop him. Thomas Jr. spent 2 years learning every detail of my financial life, memorizing my signature, studying how I signed documents, gaining access to every bank account and property deed and investment portfolio I owned. I thought he was just being thorough and responsible, thought his attention to detail proved he was ready to take over the business, but he was actually preparing to execute the most devastating theft I could imagine. He waited until he had complete access to everything, until I had signed enough papers giving him authority to act on my behalf, until the moment when one coordinated strike could transfer my entire fortune into his control before I even knew what was happening. It happened over 3 days in September while I was recovering from minor surgery, confined to my bed with post-operative pain that kept me heavily medicated and mostly unconscious. Thomas Jr. had insisted on taking care of everything while I recovered, had told me not to worry about business or finances, had assured me he would handle all the paperwork and decisions until I was back on my feet. I trusted him completely, was grateful to have a son who could manage things while I was incapacitated, had no idea he had chosen this exact moment to rob me because I would be too drugged and confused to notice what was happening until it was finished. Over those 3 days, he forged my signature on dozens of documents transferring ownership of properties from my name to his name, authorization forms moving money from my accounts to accounts he controlled, corporate papers reassigning ownership of the construction company entirely to him. He had practiced my signature so perfectly that even I would have struggled to tell the difference between his forgeries and my real signature. And he moved quickly and systematically through every asset I owned, transferring each one out of my reach while I slept off the anesthesia in my bedroom. He emptied bank accounts that held millions of dollars, transferred real estate worth additional millions, seized control of the business I had spent 40 years building, all of it done with forged documents and electronic transfers that happened faster than I could have stopped, even if I had been conscious and aware. By the time I woke up fully and started asking questions about business matters, everything was already gone and legally registered in his name. He had filed all the paperwork with banks and county clerks and government offices, had the transfers recorded and notarized with forged signatures that looked legitimate to anyone who examined them. The construction company that bore my name was now owned entirely by Thomas Jr. The mansion I lived in was deeded to him. The rental properties and investment accounts and every dollar I had accumulated over 4 decades of work had been transferred into his control through a coordinated theft that took only 72 hours to complete. I discovered what he had done when I tried to access my bank account and found it closed, when I tried to check on a property and discovered it was no longer in my name, when I started making phone calls and slowly pieced together that I had been systematically robbed by my own son while I was recovering from surgery. I confronted him in his office at the construction company, the office that used to be mine until he stole it along with everything else, and I demanded to know what he had done and why he had betrayed me after everything I had given him. He looked at me across the desk with cold eyes that held no guilt or remorse, and he told me very calmly that he had simply taken what should have been his eventually anyway, that he was tired of waiting for me to die before he could enjoy his inheritance. He said I was getting old and stupid, that I would have probably lost everything through bad decisions or dementia, that he was protecting the family wealth by taking control of it before I could destroy what he had helped build. He said the business was as much his as mine after 20 years of working there, that he deserved ownership more than I did at this point, that I should be grateful he was letting me live in the mansion instead of throwing me out immediately. I stood there listening to my son justify stealing $12 million from his own father, and I realized that the boy I raised and loved had become a monster I didn't recognize. When I told Thomas Jr. I was going to report the theft to police and fight to get my assets back through legal action, when I threatened to expose what he had done and reclaim everything he had stolen, his cold, calculated demeanor changed into something aggressive and frightening that made me realize just how dangerous he had become. He called my daughters to the office, my 2 daughters who I had supported financially their entire lives, who I had given everything to, and within an hour all 3 of my children were standing in front of me presenting a united front of betrayal and cruelty. They told me I had 2 choices. I could accept that everything was gone and quietly disappear from their lives, or they would have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to a nursing home where I would spend my final years locked away from the world. They said they had already consulted lawyers about having me declared senile and unfit to manage my own affairs, had medical records showing I was on pain medication that could be used to argue I was confused and delusional, had witnesses who would testify that I had been acting erratically and making poor decisions for months. Thomas Jr. said if I tried to fight them on the theft, they would destroy whatever shred of dignity I had left, would drag me through legal proceedings, where I would be portrayed as a confused old man who didn't understand that he had willingly transferred his assets to his children, would make sure I ended up in a state-run facility where I would die alone and forgotten. My daughters nodded in agreement, their faces showing no sympathy or guilt, just cold calculation about how to neutralize the threat I represented to their stolen wealth. I tried to reason with them, tried to appeal to whatever love they might still have for their father, reminded them of everything I had sacrificed and provided throughout their lives. But my words meant nothing to people who had already decided I was an obstacle to be removed rather than a parent deserving of respect and care. Thomas Jr. made a phone call while I was still talking, and within minutes, security guards from my own construction company arrived at the office to escort me out of the building. These were men who had worked for me for years, who I had hired and paid and treated fairly, and now they were following orders from my son to physically remove me from the business I had built. They drove me to the mansion that was no longer mine, according to the forged documents Thomas Jr. had filed. The house where I had lived for 20 years and raised my children and believed I would die peacefully in my old age. My 3 children were already there waiting for me, and they had gathered my clothes and personal belongings and thrown them out onto the front lawn in garbage bags like I was trash being disposed of. They told me I had 1 hour to take whatever I could carry and leave the property, that if I tried to come back, they would call the police and have me arrested for trespassing in a house that was legally Thomas Jr.'s property now. I stood on the lawn looking at my belongings scattered across the grass, looking at the mansion I had bought with money I earned, looking at my children who were throwing their father away like he meant nothing. Thomas Jr. laughed as I tried to gather some clothes and important papers, actually laughed at the sight of his elderly father scrambling to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. He said I was nothing now, old man, said I was too senile and too weak to prove anything or fight back. Said no one would believe me if I claimed my son had stolen from me because he had all the paperwork showing I had voluntarily transferred everything to him. My daughters stood beside him saying nothing, just watching their father being humiliated and destroyed. And I saw my grandchildren peeking out from windows of the mansion, watching their grandfather being thrown out like garbage. The locks had already been changed on every door, the security codes had been reset. Every method of accessing my own house had been disabled while I was being driven there. I was homeless in an instant, standing on a lawn with garbage bags full of clothes, with nowhere to go and no money to get there because my son had stolen every dollar I had. For 8 months, I lived under the Interstate 35 bridge on the outskirts of town, sleeping on cardboard that I flattened into a makeshift bed, covering myself with donated blankets from a church charity that distributed supplies to homeless people every Thursday afternoon. I was Thomas Crawford, the man who once employed 200 people and owned $12 million in assets, now invisible among the homeless population that most people drove past without a second glance. I slept near the concrete support pillars that provided some shelter from rain and wind, shared space with other forgotten men who had their own tragic stories about how they ended up living under a bridge, and I learned very quickly how brutal life becomes when you have nothing and nobody cares if you live or die. I ate meals from trash bins behind restaurants, waiting until after dark to dig through dumpsters for food that had been thrown away but was still edible if you were desperate enough. I ate half-finished sandwiches and stale bread and pizza crusts and whatever else people discarded, swallowing my pride along with garbage because pride doesn't fill an empty stomach. Sometimes I would stand outside grocery stores or fast food restaurants hoping someone would take pity on the old man and buy him a meal. But most people looked right through me like I was invisible, like homeless people aren't really human beings deserving of acknowledgement or compassion. Winter was the hardest, those freezing Texas nights when temperatures dropped below freezing and the wind cut through my inadequate layers of clothing and blankets. I would huddle against the concrete trying to preserve body heat, shaking so hard my teeth chattered, wondering if I would freeze to death before morning came. Other homeless men around me had better survival skills, knew where to find warmer places to sleep, or how to build fires without attracting police attention. But I was new to this life and slow to learn the rules of survival on the streets. I watched men die during those winter months, found them in the morning frozen and stiff, their bodies hauled away by authorities who barely investigated because homeless deaths don't generate much concern or media attention. I could have filed criminal charges against my children at any time, could have gone to police and reported the theft and the forged documents and everything they had done to steal my life. I had proof hidden in my coat lining, bank statements and property records that I had managed to save showing what I used to own, documents that could have helped build a case against Thomas Jr. and his sisters. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Couldn't bear the thought of my children going to prison even after everything they had done to me, because some stupid, stubborn part of me still loved them and hoped they might eventually feel guilty enough to help me. I told myself they would come looking for me eventually, would realize they had gone too far and would find me and bring me home and restore at least some of what they had taken. I imagined Thomas Jr. showing up at the bridge with apologies and explanations, telling me it had all been a terrible mistake, offering to make things right. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and nobody came. Nobody cared that Thomas Crawford was living under a bridge, and slowly I accepted that my children had erased me from their lives as completely as they had erased me from official records. The other homeless people knew me as Tom, didn't know I used to be someone important, didn't care about my past because everyone living under that bridge had a past they were trying to forget or escape. We shared food when we had any, warned each other about dangerous people or police sweeps, looked out for each other in the small ways that homeless communities develop to survive. These strangers showed me more kindness and solidarity than my own children had shown, and the bitter irony of that fact was not lost on me as I slowly deteriorated physically and mentally under that bridge. I was dying slowly, my health declining from malnutrition and exposure and lack of medical care, and I had accepted that I would probably die under that bridge and be buried in an unmarked grave with no family to claim my body or mourn my passing. One freezing January morning, 8 months after I had been thrown out of my mansion and left to survive on the streets, a police patrol car drove under the bridge on a routine check for homeless people who might need welfare services or medical attention. I was lying on my cardboard bed, barely conscious, my body shutting down from hypothermia because the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees overnight and my inadequate blankets and worn clothes provided almost no protection against cold that severe. I was aware of voices around me, but couldn't respond, couldn't move, couldn't do anything except lie there hoping death would come quickly if this was finally my time to go. The young police officer who found me thought at first I was already dead, my skin gray and cold to the touch, my breathing so shallow it was almost undetectable. He called for an ambulance on his radio while his partner started checking my vital signs and trying to warm me up with emergency blankets they kept in their patrol car. They searched my pockets looking for identification so they could notify family, or at least have a name to put on the hospital paperwork, and one of them found my worn leather wallet that I had managed to keep hidden during my months on the streets because it contained the last proof of who I used to be before my children stole everything. Inside that wallet was my driver's license, expired now because I hadn't been able to renew it without an address or the fees required, but still showing my photo and my name and the address where I used to live. The officer looked at the license and then looked at me lying there unconscious, trying to match the well-groomed man in the photo with the skeletal homeless person in front of him. He read the name out loud to his partner, Thomas Crawford, and the address that was listed as the mansion on the hill. The biggest and most expensive house in the entire town that everyone knew belonged to the wealthy construction company owner. The officer radioed dispatch and asked them to run the name Thomas Crawford through their system to check if there were any outstanding warrants or missing person reports or anything that might explain why a man whose ID said he lived in a mansion was dying under a bridge. The dispatcher came back after a few minutes with information that made the officer freeze in confusion and disbelief. Information that didn't make sense given the evidence lying unconscious in front of him. According to official records, according to the death certificate that had been filed with the county 6 months earlier, Thomas Crawford was dead, had died of natural causes in his sleep, had been cremated, and his estate had been settled by his surviving children. The officer looked at his partner with an expression of complete bewilderment, holding my driver's license in one hand and his radio in the other, trying to understand how a legally dead man could be lying unconscious under a bridge. His partner suggested there must be some mistake in the system. Maybe a different Thomas Crawford had died and the records got mixed up. But the address matched and the age matched, and when they looked more carefully at my face, they could see resemblance to the photo, despite months of homelessness having aged me dramatically. The ambulance arrived and paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher, hooking me up to warming devices and IV fluids, working urgently to save a life that was barely hanging on. The officer kept my wallet as evidence, kept the driver's license that said I lived in a mansion and was supposedly dead according to government records, and he made additional calls on his radio requesting that detectives meet him at the hospital because something was very wrong with this situation. He had found what appeared to be a ghost, a dead man still breathing, a homeless person who owned a mansion, and he knew that whatever the explanation turned out to be, there was a story here that needed immediate investigation. I was unconscious through all of this, unaware that my identity had finally been discovered, unaware that the machinery of justice was about to start moving in ways that would destroy my children's lives the same way they had destroyed mine. The officer arrived at the hospital and immediately requested that detectives from the fraud division meet him there because what he had discovered under that bridge was potentially evidence of serious crimes that went far beyond simple identity theft or paperwork errors. While doctors worked to stabilize my condition and bring my body temperature back to safe levels, the officer sat in a waiting room researching Thomas Crawford in every database available to law enforcement, and what he found painted a picture of systematic fraud and elder abuse that shocked him despite his years of experience dealing with criminal behavior. There was indeed a death certificate filed 6 months earlier, declaring that Thomas Crawford had died of natural causes at age 68, signed by a doctor and witnessed by family members who claimed to have been present at the time of death. The estate had been officially settled through probate court, with Thomas Crawford Jr. listed as the executor and primary beneficiary of his father's assets, including the mansion, the construction company, multiple properties, and financial accounts totaling approximately $12 million. An obituary had been published in the local newspaper describing Thomas Crawford as a beloved father and grandfather who had passed peacefully in his sleep surrounded by family, with funeral services held at the town's largest church and burial in the family plot at the city cemetery. Everything about the official record indicated that Thomas Crawford had died and been properly mourned and his estate legally distributed to his surviving children, except for the inconvenient fact that Thomas Crawford was lying in a hospital bed down the hall, very much alive, despite being severely hypothermic. The detectives who arrived at the hospital looked at the evidence and immediately understood they were dealing with something unprecedented in their experience. A case where a living person had been declared legally dead by family members who stood to inherit his fortune, and where that same person had been found 8 months later living homeless under a bridge while his children spent his stolen money. They pulled the death certificate and examined it closely, noted the doctor's signature and the family witnesses, and began the process of determining whether this was an honest mistake or deliberate fraud designed to steal a man's entire estate while he was still alive. They contacted the doctor whose signature appeared on the death certificate, and he initially insisted he had signed it in good faith after examining a body that Thomas Crawford Jr. had told him was his deceased father. But when detectives pressed him about the details, when they asked about the specific circumstances of the examination and death determination, the doctor's story started falling apart under scrutiny. He admitted he had only briefly viewed a body in the mansion that was covered with sheets except for the face, that Thomas Jr. had been crying and distraught and insisting they needed the death certificate processed quickly for religious reasons, that he had signed the paperwork mostly based on the son's representations rather than a thorough medical examination. The detectives realized that Thomas Jr. had likely shown the doctor an unconscious or heavily sedated father rather than a corpse, had manipulated a sympathetic physician into signing a death certificate for a living person, had used that fraudulent document to begin the process of stealing his father's entire estate through probate court. They pulled records showing that immediately after the death certificate was filed, Thomas Jr. had moved quickly to transfer properties and liquidate accounts and consolidate his father's wealth under his own control, using the legal presumption of death to justify transactions that would have required his father's living consent under normal circumstances. The obituary had been published. Funeral services had been held with a closed casket that supposedly contained Thomas Crawford's cremated remains, and dozens of people had attended to pay their respects to a man who was actually being thrown out of his own house and forced to live on the streets. The cruelty and calculation involved in declaring a living father dead, holding fake funeral services, and stealing his entire fortune while he still breathed was almost incomprehensible even to experienced detectives who thought they had seen every variation of human evil. But the evidence was undeniable. Thomas Crawford had been legally erased by his own children while he was still alive. And now that he had been found, that erasure was about to be violently reversed. I woke up in the hospital 3 days after being found under the bridge, my body slowly recovering from hypothermia, but my mind still foggy from months of malnutrition and exposure and the trauma of everything I had endured. There were 2 detectives sitting in chairs beside my hospital bed, waiting patiently for me to regain consciousness so they could ask questions about the identification found in my wallet and the death certificate that said I shouldn't exist anymore. When I opened my eyes and saw them there in their suits with their badges and their serious expressions, I thought at first they were going to arrest me for something. Thought maybe my children had found a way to make me a criminal as well as a ghost. But the detective closest to my bed leaned forward and said very gently that they knew who I was. Knew I was Thomas Crawford, knew about the death certificate and the stolen assets, and the fact that I had been living under a bridge for 8 months while my family spent my money. He said they needed me to tell them everything that had happened, every detail starting from when my son first gained access to my accounts through the moment I was thrown out of my mansion, because they were building a criminal case and my testimony was crucial evidence. I started crying before I could say a single word. 8 months of held-back emotion and grief and rage pouring out in tears that I couldn't control, even though I was ashamed to break down in front of strangers. Through those tears, I told them everything, starting with how I had trusted Thomas Jr. and given him power of attorney and access to my financial life, because I thought I was preparing him to take over the family business. I told them about the 3 days when I was recovering from surgery and couldn't function, about how he used that window to forge my signature on dozens of documents transferring everything I owned into his name. I told them about confronting him and being threatened with commitment to a nursing home if I tried to fight back, about being physically removed from my own business by security guards who followed my son's orders, about finding my belongings thrown on the lawn of the mansion that was no longer legally mine. I showed them the scars on my arms from where I had been roughly handled during the eviction, showed them documents I had hidden in my coat lining that proved what I used to own before everything was stolen, gave them names and dates and account numbers and every piece of information I could remember about the systematic theft of my entire life. The detectives took notes and recorded my statement and treated me with more respect and compassion than my own children had shown me in years. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like maybe someone actually believed me and cared about what had been done to me. I told them about the death certificate, even though I hadn't known it existed until they informed me, told them I had no idea my children had declared me legally dead and held funeral services while I was living under a bridge. The detective said they had already begun investigating the fraud involved in filing a false death certificate, that the doctor who signed it was cooperating with their investigation, that they were building a case that would result in serious criminal charges against all 3 of my children. I asked them why they were helping me when I hadn't filed charges myself, when I had chosen to suffer in silence rather than send my children to prison. And they said I no longer had a choice because once they discovered evidence of crimes this serious, they were obligated to prosecute regardless of what the victim wanted. Part of me was relieved that the decision had been taken out of my hands, that I wouldn't have to live with the guilt of sending my own children to prison because the state was going to do it for me. But another part of me still loved those children despite everything they had done, still remembered the babies I had held and the young people I had raised, and knowing they were about to face justice for their crimes filled me with complicated emotions I couldn't untangle. The detectives said they would need me to cooperate fully with their investigation, to testify in court when the time came, to help them prove what had been done so my children could be held accountable. I agreed because what choice did I have? And because maybe some part of me wanted them to face consequences for treating their father like garbage and leaving him to die under a bridge. Within 48 hours of my statement being recorded, forensic accountants from the district attorney's office descended on every bank and financial institution that held accounts related to my stolen assets, armed with court orders demanding complete transaction histories and documentation of every transfer that had occurred since Thomas Jr. gained access to my money. They traced every single dollar that had been moved out of my accounts, followed the digital trails through multiple transfers and shell corporations and attempts to hide the money, and slowly reconstructed a complete picture of how $12 million had been systematically stolen and spent over the course of 8 months. The evidence they gathered was overwhelming and undeniable, a paper trail so clear that even the best lawyers my children could afford wouldn't be able to explain it away. Thomas Jr. had purchased 3 houses in his name, using my money, luxury properties in different states that he claimed were investment opportunities, but that really represented him spreading the stolen wealth across multiple locations to make it harder to trace and recover. He had bought expensive cars for himself and his sisters, a Mercedes and a BMW and a Range Rover, all purchased with cash that came from liquidating my investment accounts. He had taken his family on elaborate vacations to Europe and the Caribbean, staying in 5-star hotels and eating at expensive restaurants and posting photos on social media of their luxurious lifestyle while I was eating from trash bins under a bridge. Every purchase was documented, every transaction traced back to accounts that had been mine before he forged documents to transfer them into his control. My daughters had been equally involved in spending the stolen money, using their share to remodel their homes and buy jewelry and fund spa retreats and shopping trips that cost more in a single day than I had spent on food in 8 months of homelessness. The forensic accountants found evidence that all 3 of my children had coordinated their theft, had planned together how to divide the assets and cover their tracks, had communicated through emails and text messages about the best way to liquidate my estate and distribute the proceeds before I could somehow interfere. Those communications proved conspiracy, proved this wasn't just Thomas Jr. acting alone, but all 3 of my children working together to rob and erase their father. The false death certificate was examined by medical experts and document analysts who confirmed it was fraudulent, that the doctor had been manipulated into signing it without properly verifying death, that Thomas Jr. had likely showed him an unconscious or sedated father rather than an actual corpse. The funeral home that had supposedly handled my cremation admitted under questioning that they had never actually received a body, that Thomas Jr. had paid them to issue cremation paperwork for a service that never occurred, that they had participated in the fraud either knowingly or through negligence that bordered on criminal. The cemetery where my memorial marker had been placed confirmed that no burial had actually occurred, that the gravesite was empty, that this too was part of the elaborate fiction my children had constructed to support their claim that I was dead. Investigators interviewed people who had attended my funeral services, and several of them reported feeling uncomfortable about the closed casket and the rushed nature of the proceedings. Said Thomas Jr. had discouraged anyone from spending too much time at the service or asking too many questions about the circumstances of my death. Some of my former employees came forward with information about seeing me in town after the supposed death date, about being told by Thomas Jr. that the old man they saw was a homeless person who looked like his deceased father, about feeling confused but not questioning the explanation because who would believe a son would lie about his father being dead? The investigation expanded to include the lawyer who had processed the probate paperwork, the county clerk who had filed the death certificate, the financial institutions that had allowed transfers based on fraudulent documents, all the people and systems that had failed to catch obvious red flags that a living person was being declared dead and robbed. Within 2 weeks, the detectives had built an airtight case against my 3 children, had compiled evidence that would result in multiple felony charges each, had reconstructed my stolen life in enough detail that no jury would have any doubt about what had been done to me. Police arrested all 3 of my children simultaneously on a Thursday morning, coordinating the timing so none of them could warn the others or destroy evidence or flee before being taken into custody. They arrested Thomas Jr. at the country club where he was playing golf with business associates, walking onto the green in the middle of his game and handcuffing him in front of a dozen witnesses who knew him as the successful construction company owner. They arrested my oldest daughter at a luxury spa where she was enjoying a massage paid for with money stolen from her father, pulling her out of the treatment room still wrapped in a robe and placing handcuffs on her wrists, while other spa clients watched in shock. They arrested my youngest daughter at her home, where she was hosting a lunch party for friends, dragging her out of her own dining room in front of guests who had been eating food purchased with my stolen money. The charges read against each of them were extensive and damning, a litany of crimes that would result in decades of prison time if convicted on all counts. Elder abuse for the systematic exploitation and abandonment of their elderly father. Grand theft for stealing $12 million in assets through fraud and forgery, conspiracy for coordinating their crimes together, filing false government documents for the fraudulent death certificate, identity theft for using my information without permission, and multiple counts of forgery for every document they had falsified with my signature. The bail for each of them was set at $1 million, an amount intended to keep them in custody while awaiting trial. And none of them could make bail because most of their liquid assets had been frozen by court order as proceeds of crime subject to forfeiture. I watched the arrests on the evening news from my hospital bed where I was still recovering from hypothermia and malnutrition, watched my children being led away in handcuffs with shocked expressions on their faces, watched news reporters describing the elaborate fraud and the millionaire father who had been found living under a bridge. The story made national news because of how unusual and cruel it was. A wealthy man declared dead and robbed by his own children while he suffered on the streets, and suddenly everyone in the country knew the names Thomas Crawford and Thomas Crawford Jr. and what they represented. My children's faces were plastered across television screens and newspapers and internet articles, their crimes detailed for millions of people to read about and judge, their reputations destroyed as thoroughly as they had tried to destroy me. Thomas Jr.'s construction company collapsed within days of his arrest as clients canceled contracts and employees quit rather than be associated with someone accused of such heinous crimes against his own father. The business I had spent 40 years building was destroyed not by my management, but by my son's greed and criminality, and I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that his theft had ultimately cost him the very thing he thought he was securing by robbing me. My daughter's social circles abandoned them as word spread about what they had done, former friends giving interviews to news outlets about how shocked they were that people they knew could be capable of such cruelty, and the comfortable social positions my daughters had enjoyed evaporated overnight. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but my children's lawyers advised them to accept plea deals rather than face a jury that would almost certainly convict them based on the overwhelming evidence prosecutors had compiled. Thomas Jr. received a sentence of 18 years in state prison. My oldest daughter received 15 years. My youngest daughter received 12 years. All of them led away to begin serving their sentences while I sat in the courtroom watching the children I had raised being punished for trying to erase me from existence. The judge said during sentencing that he had rarely seen crimes as calculated and cruel as what these defendants had done to their own father, that the betrayal of familial trust made their actions especially heinous, that the sentences reflected not just the theft, but the complete moral bankruptcy required to declare a living father dead and leave him to die on the streets. I felt nothing watching them be sentenced, no satisfaction or grief or vindication, just a hollow numbness where love used to live before they killed it with their betrayal. Thomas Crawford reclaimed his name and his legal status as a living person through court proceedings that officially reversed the fraudulent death certificate and restored him to existence in government records, but the process of reclaiming his stolen assets took months of additional legal battles and negotiations with financial institutions. The mansion was returned to his ownership, along with the construction company and the properties that hadn't yet been sold, and the money his children had spent was slowly recovered through seizure of their purchases and liquidation of assets they had bought with stolen funds. By the time everything was sorted out, I had recovered approximately $9 million of the original $12 million, The remaining $3 million lost to purchases that couldn't be recovered, or money that had been spent in ways that left no tangible assets to seize. I moved back into the mansion briefly, just to prove I could, just to walk through rooms that had been stolen from me and reclaim the space that was rightfully mine. But living there felt wrong and empty without the family I thought I had. Every room reminded me of my children when they were young, of happier times before greed destroyed everything, and I couldn't bear to stay in a house filled with ghosts of people who no longer existed in the forms I remembered them. I put the mansion on the market and sold it within a month to a young family who would fill it with better memories than mine, and I used the proceeds along with most of my other recovered assets to fund something more meaningful than personal wealth. I kept only enough money to live modestly, maybe $500,000 that would generate sufficient investment income to cover my basic needs without requiring me to work or worry about finances. The rest, approximately $8.5 million, I donated to organizations that help homeless people and fight elder abuse, causes that meant something to me after spending 8 months living under a bridge and being victimized by my own children. I funded homeless shelters in 3 cities, created grants for elder protection services, established legal aid programs for seniors whose families were exploiting them, turned my stolen fortune into something that would help people who were suffering the way I had suffered. The construction company I sold to my former employees through a cooperative ownership structure that gave them equity and control, ensuring that the business I built would continue but would benefit the workers who actually did the labor rather than enriching one family. I didn't want my children's crimes to destroy the jobs and livelihoods of 200 innocent people who depended on that company. So I made sure they had a path to ownership and stability, even without the Crawford family name attached. It felt right to distribute the wealth I had built to the people who helped create it, rather than hoarding it for myself or leaving it to children who had proven they didn't deserve it. I live quietly now in a small apartment in a modest neighborhood. No mansion and no empire and no family. But I have my dignity back and my name back and the satisfaction of knowing my children are facing consequences for their cruelty. Thomas Jr. and his sisters call me sometimes from prison, leave voicemails begging for forgiveness and asking me to help them appeal their sentences. But I delete those messages without listening to them completely because I have nothing to say to people who declared me dead and left me to freeze under a bridge. They made their choices, committed their crimes, and now they're serving their time while I live whatever years I have left in peace. The old man police found dying under that bridge was once a millionaire who employed half a county and lived in a mansion on a hill, but he lost everything when his family stole his wealth and declared him legally dead while he still breathed. When police found his identification and discovered a ghost who refused to stay buried, when the investigation uncovered a fraud so cruel it made national news, justice was finally served to a family who thought they could erase their father and live happily on his stolen fortune. My children rot in prison now serving sentences that will keep them locked away for over a decade each. And I spend my days helping other people avoid the same fate I suffered, turning my tragedy into something meaningful that outlasts the greed that nearly destroyed me.